The night was supposed to be just like any other for Mrs. Johnson. She had just finished her shift at the diner and was heading home, tired but relieved to finally rest. But as she walked down the dimly lit sidewalk, a police cruiser suddenly pulled up beside her. The officer stepped out, his face hard and unreadable. "Ma'am, what are you doing out here this late?" His tone wasn't one of concern. It was something else. Suspicion. Judgment. Mrs. Johnson clutched her purse, confused. "I'm just going home," she replied calmly. But that wasn't enough. The officer's eyes darted to a nearby trash can, and what happened next would shake her to her core. He accused her, without reason, of dumping trash on the street. Before she could even process the absurdity of it, he ordered her to do something unthinkable. Pick up the garbage and eat it. Her heart pounded. This couldn't be real. People were watching, but no one dared to step in. Helpless and humiliated, she hesitated. Then, just as the officer's patience wore thin, a voice cut through the tense air. "Step away from my mother." Everyone turned. A man in a sharp suit, eyes blazing with fury, walked toward them. He wasn't just anyone. He was her son, an attorney, and he had arrived just in time. The officer's hand tightened on his belt as he turned to face the man approaching. His confident stride, the way he carried himself. It was clear this wasn't just some random bystander. Mrs. Johnson felt a rush of relief, but the fear still gripped her. She knew her son, Jordan, was a fighter, but this officer had all the power in this moment. "Sir, this is a police matter," the officer said coldly, eyes scanning Jordan up and down. Jordan didn't flinch. "No, this is harassment," he shot back. "And I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." The officer's jaw tightened. There was hesitation now, just a flicker, but it was there. Jordan had seen this look before, in the courtroom, when someone realized they had stepped too far over the line. Mrs. Johnson's hands trembled. She had raised Jordan to be strong, to stand up for what was right, but she also knew how these situations could go. "Mom, are you okay?" Jordan asked, his voice gentler now. She nodded quickly, not trusting herself to speak. The officer scoffed. "You need to back off before you make things worse." Jordan tilted his head. Worse for who? His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. The tension was thick now. A silent standoff. And then blue and red lights flashed in the distance. The officer's eyes flicked toward the approaching police car, his posture stiffening. For a moment he looked unsure, but then his expression hardened again. He wasn't about to back down, especially not in front of witnesses. "Stay out of this," he warned Jordan, his voice low and firm. "This isn't your fight." Jordan let out a slow breath, keeping his hands visible. "It is my fight when it involves my mother." And when an officer abuses his authority, it becomes everyone's fight. Mrs. Johnson swallowed hard, feeling the weight of years of struggle pressing down on her. She had seen too many moments like this play out in the news, had heard too many stories that didn't end well. She wanted to believe Jordan's presence would change the outcome, but the officer's grip on power was still strong. "You don't know who you're messing with," the officer muttered, his voice laced with something unspoken. A threat? A warning? Jordan didn't flinch. "Neither do you." The second police car rolled to a stop, and two officers stepped out. One of them, a senior-looking officer, scanned the scene with sharp eyes. His gaze landed on Mrs. Johnson, then Jordan, then the cop standing too close to her. "What's going on here?" the older officer asked. For the first time, the cop hesitated. But before he could answer, a voice from the crowd spoke up. "I saw everything." The onlookers had been quiet, hesitant, but now one woman stepped forward. Then another, and another. The weight of silence was breaking. The cop shifted uncomfortably. He had expected fear. But now, with multiple eyes on him, things were slipping out of his control. Jordan met his mother's eyes briefly, his expression steady. This wasn't over yet, not even close. The air felt thick with tension. The senior officer's gaze lingered on Mrs. Johnson, then moved to the cop standing beside her. His stance, the way he avoided eye contact, it told a story without words. Jordan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. This officer falsely accused my mother of littering and tried to humiliate her in front of everyone. That's abuse of power. The crowd murmured in agreement. The woman who had spoken earlier cleared her throat. I saw it too. He made her pick up trash that wasn't even hers. And then she hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Johnson before finishing. He told her to eat it. The senior officer's face darkened. Is that true? The cop's jaw tightened. That's not what happened, he said quickly. She was being uncooperative, and I was trying to make a point. A point? Jordan's voice sharpened. By degrading her in public, he turned to the growing crowd. You all saw what happened. This officer thought no one would speak up, but now the truth is out. More voices joined in. Some whispered. Others called out, demanding answers. The cop shifted uneasily. His confidence was cracking. The senior officer raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. He looked at Mrs. Johnson. Ma'am, do you want to file a formal complaint? She hesitated. Years of being ignored, dismissed. What difference would it make? But then she looked at Jordan. At the crowd standing behind her. This time, she wasn't alone. Before she could answer, the cop's radio crackled. A voice on the other end spoke hurriedly, too low to make out the words. Whatever was said made the officer's face go pale. Then, without warning, he took a step back. His hand hovered near his belt. Not his gun, but his taser. The crowd gasped. Jordan's body tensed. Don't, he warned, his voice deadly calm. The moment hung in the air, frozen in time. A single move could change everything. The world seemed to slow as the officer's fingers hovered near his taser. A single wrong move could send everything spiraling out of control. Jordan's hands stayed open at his sides, his body tense but steady. He wasn't about to let this escalate, not without a fight on his terms. Before anyone could react, the senior officer stepped in. Stand down, he ordered, his voice sharp. His eyes locked onto the cop's hand. I said stand down. The officer hesitated, his breath coming short, his fingers twitching. But then, as if snapping back to reality, he slowly lowered his hand. The tension in the air didn't fade, it only shifted. Jordan exhaled, but his guard didn't drop. You were about to tase an innocent woman because you got caught abusing your badge, he said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. The officer clenched his jaw, but before he could defend himself, another sound interrupted the moment, one no one had expected. A car door slammed behind them. Then another. Jordan turned just in time to see two men in suits stepping out of a sleek black vehicle parked at the curb. Their presence immediately changed everything. They weren't cops. They weren't part of the crowd. And from the way they carried themselves, they were here for something serious. The senior officer noticed them too. His face shifted, unreadable, but there was something in his posture, something uneasy. One of the men adjusted his suit jacket, his eyes scanning the scene before settling on Jordan. Then, in a smooth, controlled voice, he asked, "Are you Jordan Johnson?" Jordan's pulse quickened. He didn't know these men. But the way they said his name, the weight behind it, this wasn't random. He squared his shoulders. Who's asking? The man exchanged a glance with his partner, then looked back at Jordan. We need to talk. Right now." The officer who had started this entire mess took a step back, his confidence cracking even more. He knew something. Mrs. Johnson reached for Jordan's arm, worry in her eyes. "Jordan, who are they?" she whispered. Jordan didn't know. But he was about to find out. And something told him this was far bigger than just a corrupt cop. Jordan's heartbeat pounded in his ears as the suited men stepped closer. The crowd had fallen silent, watching, waiting. Even the corrupt officer, so confident minutes ago, looked like he wanted to disappear. The man in the suit pulled out a badge, but it wasn't a police badge. "FBI," he said, keeping his voice low but firm. "We've been investigating misconduct in this department, and we need your help." Jordan's mind raced. The cop who had harassed his mother stiffened, his face draining of color. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, trying to back away, but the senior officer blocked his path. "Stay right where you are," the older cop ordered, his voice sharp. He turned to the FBI agents. "I assume you have reason to be here." The second agent nodded. "We've been tracking reports of officers targeting innocent citizens, falsifying charges, and covering their tracks. This man," he gestured toward the officer, "has been on our radar for months." Jordan folded his arms. "And you've just happened to show up now." The first agent met his gaze. "We were already nearby, monitoring a separate case. When we saw the live video," he nodded toward a bystander still holding up their phone, "we realized we had to step in." Mrs. Johnson looked up at Jordan, her eyes wide. Someone was recording. Jordan turned to see a teenager gripping their phone, still streaming. The comments were flooding in, thousands of people watching in real time. The truth was out. The officer suddenly lunged, making a break for his patrol car, but the senior officer was faster. In a swift motion, he grabbed the cop's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground. "Enough," he barked. "You're done." The crowd erupted, some in shock, others cheering. The once powerful officer, now face down on the pavement, had lost everything in seconds. Jordan exhaled, finally feeling the tension lift. He turned to the agents. "So what happens now?" The first agent exchanged a glance with his partner. "We take it from here. But if you're willing, we'd like you to help us bring down the rest of them." Jordan hesitated. He was a lawyer, not an investigator. But looking at his mother, still shaken but standing strong, he knew the fight wasn't over. Mrs. Johnson squeezed his hand. "Whatever you decide," she whispered, "I'm proud of you." Jordan took one last look at the officer being led away, then turned back to the agents. "Tell me everything." The battle was just beginning. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance as the corrupt officer was taken away. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmuring about everything they had just witnessed. Some were still recording, others shaking their heads in disbelief. What started as another night of injustice had turned into something much bigger. Mrs. Johnson let out a deep breath, rubbing her arms as if shaking off the weight of what had just happened. Jordan turned to her, concern in his eyes. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her voice was still unsteady. "I am now." The FBI agents exchanged a look before one of them handed Jordan a card. "We'll be in touch. This isn't over." Jordan took the card, running his fingers over the printed letters. He had spent years fighting in courtrooms, but this was something different. And yet, he knew he couldn't walk away. Mrs. Johnson reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You always said you wanted to make a difference," she said softly. "Maybe this is how." Jordan looked at her, then at the city around them. The system was broken, but change wasn't impossible. As they walked away together, he knew one thing for sure. This fight wasn't just for his mother. It was for everyone who never got the chance to stand up. And he wasn't backing down.